America's top trade envoy walked into a congressional hearing on April 22, 2026, and said out loud what Washington had been muttering behind closed doors for months. Jameson Greer, the United States Trade Representative, looked at the House Ways and Means Committee and declared that the U.S. is kind of at the end of our rope in just asking for them to do this. He threatened enforcement action, he compared Canada to China, and he accused Canadian officials of deflecting responsibility for a dispute that has been sitting like a lit fuse beneath the trade relationship between the two countries that, until recently, most people assumed would never actually go to war with each other economically. Then, Mark Carney walked to a microphone and said something that reframed the entire argument. Over the next few minutes, I want to show you exactly what Greer said, what Carney said back, why neither side is prepared to move first, and what the actual numbers on the ground tell you about where this is heading. Because this is not fundamentally a story about bourbon and Sauvignon Blanc. That is the surface layer. Underneath it is a story about two governments operating from incompatible economic philosophies, a July 1st deadline neither side is prepared to meet, and a Canadian Prime Minister who has decided that unilateral concessions are no longer part of his playbook. Here is what actually happened on April 22nd. Greer was testifying before the House Ways and Means Committee on Trump's broader trade agenda when the question of Canada's provincial alcohol restrictions came up. Ontario's LCBO, the largest liquor purchaser in the world, has kept American beer, wine, and spirits off its shelves since early 2025, when Canadian provinces responded to the Trump tariff campaign with coordinated boycotts of American products. Quebec followed. Those two provinces together represent roughly 60% of Canada's population and a substantial share of the market that American distillers, vintners, and brewers had been counting on. Greer told Congress his patience was exhausted. My sense is there may have to be an enforcement action to deal with this issue on wine and spirits in Canada, he said. He offered no specifics about what that enforcement would look like, but the direction was clear. Washington is done asking nicely. Then Greer escalated further. Think about it this way. There are two countries that have retaliated economically against the United States in the past year, the People's Republic of China and Canada, he told the committee. He went on to describe the two countries' trade models as ones that don't fit together very well, accusing Canada of doubling down on globalization while Washington is attempting to correct for its failures. Take a moment to absorb what that framing is actually doing. Greer is not simply threatening Canada over liquor store shelf space. He is placing Canada in the same strategic category as the United States' primary geopolitical adversary. He is telling Congress, and through Congress, the American public, that Canada is an economic opponent rather than an ally. Congresswoman Claudia Tenney pressed him specifically on Canadian dairy and supply management barriers, calling supply management a rigged system, and Greer confirmed he had raised it with Canadian officials repeatedly and frequently without receiving any commitments in return. That is a significant escalation in the formal record from a sitting U.S. trade representative testifying under oath. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was equally blunt on the same day, calling it outrageous that Canada would not put American spirits back on shelves. A New Hampshire senator pushed back directly, telling Lutnick that Canada was refusing precisely because of the insults and pressure coming from the American side. She was not wrong about the sequence of events. Here is what the actual timeline looks like, because context is not optional here. The provinces did not act first. They reacted. In February 2025, the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods, a 10% tariff on Canadian energy exports, and 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. Additional duties followed on copper, softwood lumber, heavy-duty trucks, and automotive components across the year. When those tariffs landed, Ontario Premier Doug Ford who had previously maintained a constructive working relationship with Washington, pulled American products from LCBO shelves. He expects us to sit back and roll over. You never roll over to a bully. You confront them head-on, Ford said at a Globe and Mail conference on April 22nd. He has been consistent in his position every time the question is raised. American alcohol goes back on shelves when the tariffs on Canadian industries are lifted. That is not a soft negotiating posture. It is a wall. Now, here is where the employment numbers make it impossible to ignore the cause and effect relationship that Washington keeps trying to avoid discussing. Statistics Canada's labor force survey for the 12 months ending in early 2026 shows that manufacturing has taken the biggest hit of any sector in the Canadian economy, shedding 51,800 jobs over that period, with losses concentrated in Ontario, where manufacturing has a larger footprint than anywhere else in the country. The Financial Accountability Office of Ontario projected that U.S. tariffs could result in 119,200 fewer jobs in Ontario alone by the end of 2026, compared to a scenario without tariffs. The manufacturing sector's real GDP in Ontario is projected to be significantly lower than it would have been without the trade war. The motor vehicle parts industry faces a major reduction in real output. Primary metals face steep declines. Ontario's unemployment rate hit 7.8% in 2025, the highest it had been since before the pandemic, driven primarily by tariff-related layoffs in automotive manufacturing and steel. Windsor's unemployment rate climbed to 11.2%, the highest in the province. Cities including Windsor, Guelph, Brantford, Kitchener, Cambridge, and London are the most exposed communities. Economists who have spent a year analyzing the impact now describe the Canadian labor market as static, rather than recovering, not in freefall, but with fewer new openings, slower hiring, and less leverage for workers trying to change jobs or negotiate wages. Risks are now spreading beyond the directly tariff-exposed sectors into services and industries not directly tied to the new trade environment. An auto parts worker in southwestern Ontario losing a regular shift eventually stops buying coffee on the way to work. That coffee shop eventually cuts staff. That ripple effect is now visible in the data. So when Greer stands before Congress and frames Canada as the source of the problem, he is describing a boycott that was itself a direct response to tariffs that have driven tens of thousands of Canadians out of work. The alcohol restriction is the effect. The tariffs are the cause. Washington wants to negotiate about the effect while treating the cause as non-negotiable. Carney's response made clear that Canada does not accept that framing. Speaking to reporters on Parliament Hill on April 23rd, Carney was direct. You know what's an irritant? A 50% tariff on steel and aluminum, 25% on automobiles, all of the tariffs on forest products. Those are more than irritants. Those are violations of our trade deal. He then connected the pieces explicitly. The provinces are not going to reverse the alcohol ban until there is real movement on the tariffs that devastated their economies. Progress on spirits would follow progress on the larger issues. That is not a concession. It is a description of how a transaction works. You give something, you get something. That is negotiation. Canada's minister responsible for U.S. trade, Dominic LeBlanc, was equally firm at the Globe conference. We're not going to make a series of concessions or agree to a series of things that aren't in the interest of the Canadian economy, Canadian businesses, Canadian workers, just to get to a table and have a statement appear on a website in the United States, and then receive a whole second list of things they want, he said. That position comes directly from the experience of Canada's digital services tax, which was dropped in 2025 as a goodwill gesture and produced nothing in return from the American side. Ottawa's appetite for unilateral concessions has been exhausted by the results of the last time it tried one. LeBlanc also acknowledged something that has received less attention than it deserves. His American counterparts have privately told him that some level of sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos will remain in place even after the CUSMA review concludes. They say that the sectoral tariffs, to some extent, will remain in place. I think we should be realistic. They have not taken anybody to zero, LeBlanc said. He indicated there might be room to negotiate lower rates or quota arrangements allowing a set volume of goods through at reduced tariff levels. That is the actual negotiating space as both sides understand it. Not zero tariffs, not full restoration of the pre-2025 relationship, some managed reduction on some categories, subject to conditions neither side has fully specified. On the broader CUSMA review, Canada's name for what Americans call USMCA, both governments have now acknowledged publicly that a comprehensive agreement by July 1st is unlikely. Greer told the committee that CUSMA talks may run past the July 1st deadline, while repeating his position that the U.S. has issues with Canadian trade practices across multiple areas beyond alcohol, including dairy supply management, Buy Canadian procurement policies, and the Online Streaming Act. The July 1st date is not a negotiating deadline in the sense of a cliff edge. It is a contractual trigger built into the original agreement. At that point, the three signatory governments must either renew the deal for a 16-year extension or signal their intention to conduct an annual review process. The distinction matters because the annual review path creates persistent uncertainty for every business, supply chain, and investment decision built around the integrated North American economy. LeBlanc confirmed that Canada is absolutely ready to resume discussions on quota and tariff reduction arrangements that had been under consideration as recently as October 2025. Here is the part that should concern anyone tracking the long game. A government source told the Globe and Mail that not much is expected to happen on Canada-US trade negotiations in the near term because Trump's primary focus right now is the conflict between Israel and Iran, which has consumed Washington's available bandwidth. The source also noted that Commerce Secretary Lutnick, who has taken the most openly antagonistic stance toward Canada throughout the negotiations, has largely been pushed out of the picture, with Greer now operating as the primary driver. That shift matters for tone, though it has not yet changed the substance of what the American side is demanding. While the diplomatic bandwidth in Washington has been consumed elsewhere, Carney has been moving. Since taking office, he has struck new economic and security agreements across 4 continents in 6 months. He traveled to Beijing in January 2026 for the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to China since 2017, and secured a deal lowering Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola and removing levies on lobster, crab, and peas. Trump threatened a 100% tariff on Canada if that China deal went forward. Carney said he called Trump directly and explained the arrangement. The Trump administration publicly disputed Carney's characterization of how that call went. Carney, asked about U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's claim that he had walked back his Davos remarks in a phone call with Trump, corrected the record publicly and without hesitation. To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos. In a YouTube address to Canadians in April, Carney named the structural shift plainly. The U.S. has raised tariffs to levels not seen since the Great Depression, he said. Many of Canada's historic strengths, built on deep economic integration with America, have become vulnerabilities that need to be corrected. Hope is not a plan. Nostalgia is not a strategy. He has been saying some version of this since January at Davos, where he told the World Economic Forum that middle powers must work together, because if they are not at the table, they end up on the menu. The message is consistent and deliberate. Canada is building the architecture for a more diversified economic future because it can no longer assume the American relationship will function as it did for the previous 3 decades. Canada's ambassador to the United States, Mark Wiseman, told the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee on April 23 that despite the combative public rhetoric from both sides, every actual working meeting with American officials has been respectful, open, and productive. He said trade talks need to move past the bluster on both sides. That is the gap between the diplomatic reality and the public-facing version of this conflict. A gap that has been widening since February 2025 and that neither government has yet found a way to close. Greer's statement that Canada and the United States have trade systems that don't fit together very well deserves to sit with you for a moment. He is not describing a disagreement about a specific tariff percentage or quota threshold. He is describing a fundamental philosophical divergence. Canada wants to trade more broadly with more partners across more markets, and Washington has explicitly framed that as a problem. The U.S. Trade Representative is saying on the record, under oath, that Canada's economic direction is incompatible with America's objectives. That is not the language of a dispute heading toward resolution. That is the language of a structural standoff. The most recent employment data, released in May 2026, shows Canada's unemployment rate rising to 6.9%, the highest in 6 months, with the economy shedding roughly 18,000 jobs in April alone. Goods-producing industries, the sectors most exposed to American tariffs, shed 26,800 jobs in the month. These are not abstract statistics. These are assembly lines in Windsor and Brantford, tool shops in Guelph and Cambridge, fabrication plants in London and Kitchener, where workers are losing shifts and companies are restructuring to survive a trade environment that shows no clear sign of resolution. Ford put his position on the alcohol question as plainly as anyone has throughout this dispute. Once a deal is reached, then we'll bring back maybe California red wine. You can sit down and have a glass of wine, but not before, and not as a unilateral gesture of goodwill that produces nothing in return. That is precisely where things stand right now. Washington says it is at the end of its rope. Ottawa says the rope was frayed by Washington first, and that Canada will not make the first move toward detaching from it. Neither side has put a comprehensive offer on the table that addresses both sets of core grievances simultaneously: the tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber that are driving Canadian unemployment on one side, and the provincial alcohol restrictions and dairy supply management that Washington has been demanding action on for months on the other. The July 1st date does not pause for political convenience. It does not wait for the Iran conflict to resolve, for domestic approval ratings to stabilize, or for either government to find a framework that works for both sides. It is a contractual trigger built into an agreement governing roughly $1.8 trillion in annual commerce between two neighboring economies whose supply chains are physically interwoven in ways that cannot be quickly or cheaply separated. The U.S. Trade Representative says the two economic models don't fit together. The Canadian Prime Minister says the relationship needs to be renegotiated on equal terms, not dictated from one side. The July 1st clock is running, and as of this writing, neither government has defined what a realistic deal actually looks like in the time remaining. That is not a negotiation with momentum. That is a standoff with a deadline.